Hey everyone, back again. Today we're on to Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. In any case, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is one of Marx's most important essays, and it is super relevant to understanding what's going on today. But the thing is, especially with these Marxist historical texts, is that we should resist any urge to just imply and suggest as though it maps on perfectly to today. That would be incredibly reductive, but in any case, I think it provides some very good insight into what's going on today, specifically that we see happening with Trump and that we saw in 2016. But of course, again, I really want to emphasize, doesn't map on entirely, but some very good warning signs can be picked up from this text. One of them being that the entire focus on Trump tends to obscure an actual focus on the class dimension, an actual focus on capitalist exploitation, which is exactly what Marx is going to get at here. But before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and ideas and texts and stuff in ways to try and make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can like, share, subscribe. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it as a podcast on any podcast platform. And if you found this as a podcast, you'll be able to find it on YouTube, or sometimes I have videos. I accompany the things with videos. You can follow me on other platforms if you want. That'd be great. If you want to help me out, you can do that monetarily, but please consider not, and instead donating to a Palestinian organization, a Palestinian family, or anyone that, or an organization that's even outside of Palestine doing work to help Palestinians. Please consider doing that instead before you help me. And yeah, without much further ado, let us jump into Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is, I have to say right off the bat that it would be impossible for me to cover every single detail of this text. And so really you have to read it if you want the full experience, because it is so historically dense, where Marx is writing about so many different figures in the mid 19th century in France, that it would take so long to properly cover this text. Honestly, if you were to properly cover it, you could do I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility of doing an entire 12-week course on this text alone. And I know that I might be exaggerating a bit, but I don't think I'm exaggerating that much. So with that being said, obviously I'm not going to cover every single detail. I'm going to do my best to give you the overall argument that he's making here, its relevance today, and all the key points. So the title, it refers to Louis Bonaparte's 1851 coup to overthrow the Second French Republic that he was leading. And this title is a play on the original Bonaparte, that is Napoleon Bonaparte, who performed a similar operation in the late 18th century in 1799 in what was called the 18th Brumaire, which is the second month, I believe, of the French calendar at that time. And so what Marx is doing here in the title is saying, I'm going to talk about Louis Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon, and it was Napoleon III. He's going to talk about how Louis essentially just simulated what Napoleon did. Simulated Napoleon's 18th Brumaire and did it, 50 years later. And so in the beginning of the essay, Marx makes this famous allusion to Hegel, who says that history always repeats itself. And Marx clarifies that it is not that history repeats itself. It is that history repeats itself, or history happens, and it is tragic, and then it repeats itself as a farce, as a joke. And this is exactly what Louis did here. And this is exactly what will continue to happen so long as social movements are conducted without actually identifying the underwritten factors, or the capitalist factors that underwrite these movements and that limit real revolutionary potential and possibility, while also lending potential to them. So to give you just a little bit of the history here, in the late 18th century, 1799, Napoleon becomes emperor in France. After the French Revolution, you have Napoleon kind of overthrow the government and become power. Louis would essentially do the same thing 50 years later. But in both cases, even though, it's different people, same name, Bonaparte, same name, but what also remains the same is the way in which both of these movements ended up propelling bourgeois interest and capitalist interest across France. Now, for a little bit of the specific history about what Louis did, in 1848, Louis would take power in France as an elected official, the elected leader of France. But when he took power, he was confronting two broad problems, and that was his term limit of 4 years, which is like in the US, 4-year term limit. He didn't want that to end, and he also wanted to become emperor like his uncle. He wanted to do that. He wanted to just simulate his uncle. He wanted to become a kind of farcical version. He didn't want that, but he became a kind of farcical version of his uncle. And then by 1851, he will have pretty much overthrown the parliament and established himself as emperor, which essentially resulted in the overhaul of the French political system. There was overthrow of the army, the recapture of the army, and the real expansion of bourgeois interest within government at this point. Now, this was all done ostensibly in the name of the people, where Louis viewed himself as being the embodiment of the people's will, as though he was like speaking on behalf of the people. And the resonances with Trump really cannot be ignored. I mean, this guy has a golden toilet, but claims to speak for like the working class. And it's kind of haunting how many similarities there are, like between the way that Louis would appropriate and would take advantage of the working classes to claim that he was working for them. He would pick a few people to essentially follow him around as this kind of band of working class people to lend the idea that he was working on their behalf. All the while, he's attacking Republican institutions like the free press, like the government itself, education, the military, etc., etc., etc. So let's jump into the body of the text itself. I know this is kind of a long intro. I just wanted to give that kind of broad historical overview, but now we'll get into the substance here and the more specific historical momentum that informed this. So obviously, like I said, the essay begins by commenting on the Hegelian idea that history repeats itself. But Marx corrects it to say that history doesn't just repeat itself. First, when it happens, it is tragic, but then when it happens again, it is a farce. It is farcical. And this goes to show that we are always informed by the past. And this also leads Marx to offer one of his other really important insights here, the way in which the present is always kind of haunted by the past. There's no one that exists outside of the historical continuum they find themselves in. And if that historical continuum is informed by the capitalist mode of exploitation and accumulation, then people will be informed by that. But more or less, we are all informed by the past. They can never truly escape it. Revolutions often take on the styles of those that preceded them, making them a mockery of themselves. Marx compares this to language acquisition that first depends upon continual translation to one's original language before you can actually become fluent in a new language, which is a common thing. If you've tried to learn a second language in adulthood, you do that thing where whenever you hear a word in the language you're trying to learn, you translate it into your language first, as though the only way by which you can actually take on newness is by adapting it to what you already know. So in that case, we must ask, how new is it really? And the same thing Marx says of these quote-unquote revolutions. And he will come to apply this against the social democrats. And I think this is really embodied in people like Bernie Sanders and, even the more, the right-wing elements of the Democratic Party and the overall Democratic Party in the US that claims to be a force for the people, but is really just trying to advocate for a kind of teddy bear capitalism that's not going to take on the fundamental contradictions that capitalism fosters, but instead wants to try to mitigate the effects. Of course, all that is going to do is kick the can down the road, and make it just that much more difficult to take this capitalist exploitation head on. Now, if this is kind of, you're not really sure what that means, I would encourage you to go check out my other episodes on Marx. Marx's Capital, I think, would be really informative, where he lays out exactly how capitalism is a mode of thievery. And it's a mode of thievery that has been entirely normalized, where we don't even have laws about it. It's a mode of thievery where the only way that profit is made by capitalists is if people who work for them, wage earners, are paid less than they earn the capitalists. But if you were to flip the script and say, well, why don't we create a situation in which the workers who are creating the things and everything like that, the workers are the ones who earn the full weight, the full value of what they're making. Don't resist the temptation to be like, that's not what they mean by value. Please bear with me. I mean, I'm being kind of reductive and simple about this just for the sake of time. But it would be unfathomable to imagine a situation in which the workers were actually being entirely paid for what they're getting. And so you could never imagine a situation where you walk into a store and say, I'd rather actually not pay this amount for this because I think it was procured through a kind of exploitation of these workers. I'm actually going to pay for it what it should be worth. That'd be unfathomable. In fact, we have laws to prevent people from doing that. We have laws on the books to protect landlords from renters who are trying to actually take back, land that belongs to them. It would be unfathomable, for example, a leader in the quote unquote West, a leader to come out and say, hey, I think that workers are like being totally exploited here. I think that we should encourage working strikes, walkouts, rent strikes, everything like that. Even though it would be in the name of like morality and justice, given that these systems are predicated upon just the fundamental exploitation of the majority. But because it operates under the capitalist system, it attains the status of normality, and it allows these systems to keep going, where laws are then designed not to actually defend the people, but instead to defend the upper classes and their conspiratorial counterparts, be it the political class, the media class, the academic class, go add on and on and on and on, people who work to normalize these conditions. So anyways, sorry, I digress. To return to the case of Louis Bonaparte, he caricatured his uncle, Napoleon. But Napoleon also caricatured people he exalted before him, like the Romans. And so you have Napoleon dressing up in all this kind of gladiator type stuff, like really exalting the Romans as though like it was only by appealing to that past of a certain romanticized Roman integrity that it would be possible for him to imagine a revolutionary future. And so that just already shows the limits of that revolutionary imagination, because it's only really pointing to the past, not pointing to a future. It's just reactionary in its turning to some kind of romanticized, Roman society. And this is the same thing with the entirety of the Make America Great Again rhetoric. That is, it implies as though the problem confronting America is that it's just not where it used to be, when it is exactly where it used to be if we actually recognize the material force that has been pushing it and has been guiding its existence, and that's capitalist exploitation. It's exactly where it was, except now intensified in terms of capitalist exploitation. So there is no going back. And any effort to try to frame a political movement in this turn to the past is going to lead us totally astray. And Marx writes as much. There's some pretty famous letters, maybe not letters. I'm thinking of one specifically where Marx, or Engels, I should say, Engels clarifies that the Marxist project is not one of turning back the clock. It's about looking forward. It's about recognizing that the solution is not to be found in the past, because the past was, embroiled in the same kind of capitalist exploitation that we find ourselves in today. So in Marx's words, turning to the past exaggerates to the imagination the given task to rekindle the revolutionary spirit. However, Louis's guiding impetus was not only to turn to the past. Yes, he had his uncle as a kind of motivating factor here, but we cannot ignore the fact that he did have some eye to the future. And this was a future that, at least outwardly, was one that was apparently going to improve French society. It was going to improve French society for workers and everything like this. Obviously that's not at all what happened, but there was a little bit of this turn to the future. And there are problems too turning to the future is not in itself a Marxist solution. Even though Engels says that Marxism is a project for the future, maybe it's a project for the present today, because he was writing that, a long time ago. But in any case, we should not fall into the trap of romanticizing an imagined future, because there's always some risks there. But he was guided by this desire for this romanticization for the future and the fruits that it would reap for himself mostly. Even though he claimed it was for the people, it was really for himself. Now, in contrast, proletarian revolutions struggle to capitalize on its own victories, and it loses its gumption often that, it's easily found among the bourgeois, which Marx kind of laments in terms of the proletarian revolutionary spirit, which would take a hard hit in 1848. We're gonna talk about that, but the problem, or one of the challenges confronting the proletarian revolution, is that it is largely stepping into the abyss and the unknown. And Marx is very clearly unclear about what post-capitalist futures will look like. I mean, you can find kind of sketches of it through his work. He tries to imagine this, and this isn't in any way to discredit what he's putting forward. I mean, it was a speculative project, and it was an extremely important one. But the actual machinations of a future communism, that is one that is actually truthful to Marx's goal, that is all the workers of the world uniting, not just in specific countries or whatever, he was incredibly indescript about this, and for good reason. I mean, I would have been very suspicious if he knew exactly what it was going to look like. And it's partly for this reason that it's harder to motivate proletarian revolution than it is to, just witness bourgeois revolution, if you can call it revolution, or bourgeois interest, because bourgeois expansion results in just immediate riches for them, whereas for workers, working revolutions do not immediately translate into riches for them. And there's also this problem of workers and the proletariat really feeling like they have to be perfect. And this is something that constantly plagues. It's not just in workers' movements, but in many revolutionary and social struggles, is that there's this desire to constantly criticize oneself to be perfect. And that prevents the creation of a real moving historical revolutionary factor, because it's always scared to take the next step. This is something that can even be applied broadly to the reactionary quote-unquote left, that is often more interested in critiquing itself than putting forward actual organizing movements to mitigate the effects of capitalism at the very least, let alone to overturn it entirely. So what are some other historical things that were going on? So between about 1830 and 1848, France was ruled by Louis Philippe, and he had a significant support from the bourgeoisie. Now, with his overthrow in 1848, it appeared that the enemy was defeated. It appeared as though he was defeated. He was becoming increasingly monarchical. He was becoming increasingly despotic, and it was clear as though he was, being backed up by the parasitic bourgeois class. But that was essentially a ruse. As monarchy may have been toppled, but the bourgeois remained intact. And this is exactly what we see in many of the responses to Trump. It's that they treat it as though the problem is Trump, as though there's nothing else going on. When it's okay, we'll deal with Trump, but then unless we actually deal with the other factors here, we deal with the logics of capitalist accumulation that make people's lives worse and worse and worse, push them to conditions to then fall into the traps of reactionary, despotic government figures. Unless we deal with that, there's just going to be another Trump in a few years. And we're just going to keep going through the cycle over and over and over again. So in 1848, we would see the overthrow of the bourgeois monarchy and the establishment of the bourgeois republic. Exactly what's like the United States, for example. Same with other, capitalist nations as well. And this was led by Louis Bonaparte. He was the one who was leading this bourgeois republic in 1848 that followed this monarchy. And in Marx's words, now the whole bourgeoisie was to rule under the name of the people. So, and this is a very good Foucauldian point too, where and this is exactly why Foucault makes really good insights about the nature of power under capitalism, is that it shifts to go from monarchical sovereign power to a more distributed power. And that makes it so much harder to recognize where that power exists, because you can't point at a single figure and be oh, it's them, and then easily identify all of its funders, all of their funders and all of that. When it had been distributed, And you have the establishment of a republic that claims to vie for the people, to struggle for freedom of speech and human rights and all of this, which is, one of the big lies perpetuated today. We have this whole thing about, of course, the value of human rights can't be negated, human rights and freedom of speech and everything like this. But in doing so, we see this negation of the fact that there are classes. And we see instead this establishment of humanity as this homogenous whole of just like rights possessing individuals that isn't actually respected. And in doing so, we erase the realities of their material conditions in their exploitation, as though the world's billionaires have anything in common with the world's most destitute, exploited people, because they're united under the umbrella of possessing these human rights and being recognized as human. And it's like, this seems like perhaps this discourse is less a tool for protecting human rights and more of a tool of protecting of erasing the nature of capitalist exploitation and pretending as though these people have anything in common. Now in 1848, a great sign of this, like Louis Bonaparte, who is like, fighting for this Republican stuff, really bourgeois Republican stuff, human rights, freedom of speech, yada, 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 everything like this. They began these essentially terror campaigns against workers, revolutionary workers' movements. And so they began incarcerating, exiling, sentencing to death revolutionary workers who had been struggling for revolutionary movements for the decades before this. And it just made it plain to see that despite this claim to represent people and humans, it was really just about representing capital. And so in 1848, this Republican Party would take on the status or the identity of what they called the Party of Order. Very similar to the Republicans. I mean, the parallels it's very clearly a similar thing. The Party of Order, in which this logic of order would be used to then police anything they designated as being disorderly. So revolutionary ideals obviously would be recognized as disorderly, while, the violences of the state, for example, would be taken as normal. It's just part of the status quo, therefore it's not deserving of any kind of criticism or pushback or anything like that. So the proletarian class would be smeared as anarchists and socialists. That was a dirty word back then too. Against order, the family, property, and religion as the driving, real elements of French society. And from that point on, anything even remotely critical of the bourgeois, even left-wing bourgeois values or ideas, would be smeared as socialist. So it was clear that this new government of 1848, run by Louis Bonaparte, it would establish its republican constitution that promised liberal freedoms only insofar as they do not affect, quote-unquote, public safety. Very common thing, that is essentially affect the bourgeois. Anything that affects them, fine. So its life would be short, though. Only a few months later, Louis would cozy up to the National Assembly and the military wing to flex its power against the democratic wings of Parliament and then government, and proudly open the door for the bourgeois capture of its ally, the Republicans. He also knew his term was ending in 1852, and so needed a reason to extend it. So he saw this end coming, starting in 1848, knew 1852 was going to end, and he knew he had to start, taking power in any way that he could. And it would come through the kind of slow appeal to the bourgeois elements, also the appeal to large swaths of workers, and I'll get into the details of that, also capturing, taking over the military, being, cozying up to them and everything like that. So the governmental conflict then would be between the Party of Order, that is these Republicans, the Louis Republicans, versus against La Montagne, the mountain, which were essentially the Democrats, the social democrats here. Now, just to make that clear, but the repetitions are not only farcical, that we can see here from Napoleon and that we can currently see with Trump as being another kind of repetition that's quite farcical if we take Marx's words seriously. But these repetitions are not the only farcical element here. The Republicans essentially would end up threatening the Republic, like with Trump. I mean, the guy claims, his whole party claims that they're defending the nation, and then they immediately get in and start tearing the nation down, start defending capitalism and then start doing tariffs, isn't that just state control over the free flow of dollars and goods? Sounds like socialism to me. You had essentially proletarians at this moment too, threatening workers, etc. And that's still very true today, where you have definitely reactionary elements within workers' movements that don't want to push for a workers' revolution, that try instead, that rely upon unionizing as being the only form of political actual revolutionary engagement, which is, of course, a reactionary force that just tries to mitigate the effects of capitalism, not actually overturn them. Which isn't, I'm saying this now as I'm a member of union leadership, so SEIU, but still can recognize this element of union organizing. Better that than nothing at this moment. So the Party of Order would capture essentially everything, where they were in possession of the government, of the army, of the legislative body, in short, in Marx's words, of the total power of the state. And it was morally strengthened by the general elections that caused their sovereignty to appear as the will of the people, because they won these quote-unquote free elections. And with this victory, it appeared as though they were actually following the will of the people. Of course, there was huge cases of voter suppression, of restricting voting access. They obviously would never admit that. Similar thing with Republicans. Makes a lot of sense. And they would come to stand in for the victory of the counter-revolution. That is the reactionary, anti-revolutionary spirit throughout all of Europe. That is this Party of Order. Now, different sects of the party appeared to were in conflict with one another. Now, within the Party of Order, there was a conflict, kind of a conflict, between who were called the Legitimists and the Orleanists, the Orleanists. Now, the Legitimists from Marx, they stood in for and really represented what is called landed property. So really, capital that can be derived from the land, farmers, stuff like that. Whereas the Orleanists represented city capital. The capital of industry, city-based industry that was pretty making a lot of money, of course. And it appeared as though this was an actually substantial conflict, when really it wasn't. Clearly these two things are working hand in hand, even if capitalists might disagree with one another and might fight against one another. That is not a sign of a rift within capitalism. That is actually capitalism working entirely effectively. And this idea, it's not like I'm creating this idea. This, of course, is one way to explain how conflict within other settings comes to be informed by capitalist conflict, where it is in the interest of capitalism for there to be conflict between capitalists, because this is how competition fuels profit and everything. Again, for the diehard Marxists out there, you're going to go listen to my part 3 of Capital Volume 3, where I explain exactly what this means. But, I'm being very reductive here just for the sake of time and clarity. But the capitalism relies upon these petty squabbles in order to then push profit. But this is then, because capitalism is this kind of base element of society, it then comes to motivate other conflicts between other groups, hence there being conflicts among workers, which is just a kind of representation or a kind of borrowing from these capitalist conflicts in favor, just to disrupt possible unity and organization among workers, because capitalism is a system that can work by disunity. In fact, it kind of thrives off of that in a lot of cases. Not to say there's not a general collaboration among the capitalist class. I'm not saying that at all. But it is a system that can very much capitalize on disunity. Now, as Bonaparte and the Republicans were gaining power, the Social Democrats started to cozy up to small traders and workers in order to try to mount an actual people's resistance to this. But of course, their efforts were not very successful, because their goals were not actually in line with those of the workers. Instead, they were trying to find ways to allow capital to be more effective. Which is kind of, at the end of the day, what Democrats are in the US today are kind of vying for. They're trying to find ways to make capitalism more effective by reducing suffering, which on the first level of possible analysis, it's it might seem okay at the very least, we're dealing with harm reduction here, but that is where their project starts and ends. It tells us all that we need to know about their actual goals, and that is that they're going to keep the capitalist system churning. They're going to keep it going. And, regardless of who it'll affect, they pretend as though capitalism is not just going to keep extracting resources from the earth, extracting labor power from people, which can't happen forever. Just keep trying to elevate prices while bringing down costs, these are all contradictions found within capitalism that point to its unsustainability. I mean, we've had capitalism for 300 years, give or take, and look at the destruction it has wrought on the environment, on workers, on affordability across the planet. It's a real problem. It's absolutely a real problem. So like the Democrats today, Marx says that at the time, the social democrats at the time, they were engaging the people in a sham battle to keep them from a real battle. And this is one of the really important legitimate critiques of like the Democrats and the ways in which they capitalize upon like quote unquote identity politics as a way by which to pretend as though they're engaging in the good fight while leaving capitalism unexamined. So it seemed as though the social democratic response to the Republicans at this time was just to advocate for a transformation of society upon democratic lines. But that is a transformation within the boundaries of the small traders class. So the Social Democrats, again called La Montagne, the mountain, it borrowed from the Republicans a too heavy-handed emphasis on representing the quote-unquote people, as though there are no classes. And so in trying to represent the quote-unquote people, it was treating everybody the same, as though there were not just thieves, were like as part of the people in this world, kind of just sucking labor power and then from that creating profit for themselves at the expense of everyone. And this is totally normalized. And I mean, the Social Democrats went so far as to appeal to the army, as though the army hadn't just a few years before and up till this time, in 1848, 1849, had been rounding up proletarian revolutionaries to arrest them, to put them to death or to exile them. Very much like, Kamala Harris cozying up with Liz Cheney, right? It's like, what is that? Like, what is that? It's disgusting. So there are two kind of main conflicts that were going on here. There was the conflict between the Republicans and the Democrats, and then there was the conflict within the Republicans, still is called the Party of Order. There was a conflict within them between the Legitimists and the Orleanists. Remember, there was the people who stood for landed property and those who stood for like city, capital, everything like that. So there are these kind of conflicts here, and Bonaparte took this opportunity, these conflicts, as an opportunity to take power himself, to start the process he's going of becoming emperor, like his uncle had done. So in 1849, he began dismissing ministers from the government. He began to go after these Republican institutions he claimed to represent, like the National Assembly, the press, etc. And again, in all of this, it's really important not to fall into the trap of thinking that this is just Bonaparte just working on his own, doing something that is just his own will. Instead, this was very much the will of the capitalist class and elite. Of course, they weren't interested in an actual free press. And this is, of course, great insight from like Noam Chomsky to identify the ways in which the press has been carefully shaped, not even necessarily deliberately, but because of ideological factors, shaped to reflect capitalist ideological interests. This is why you rarely see articles in the New York Times being like, isn't it really messed up how high rent prices are? Maybe this is a systemic factor dealing with capitalism. Even though that'd be a great story. It'd be a great story. It'd be backed up with facts and evidence. You don't see that stuff. Or another thing, you see this a lot in Canada, for those of you in Canada. But some of the big news outlets in Canada do these repeated exposés of like tenants that don't leave the apartment or house that they're renting. And they do these big exposés about how hard this is for landlords. And I'm like, you can never find, or so rarely find, cases of the alternative, which is by far the most common, of like landlords arbitrarily increasing rent, kicking out their tenants who have nowhere else to go, dispossessing people all the time. You don't see articles about that because it's part of the ideological norm that is, in this case, capitalism. Now, the bourgeois at this time had a little bit of an ambiguous view of Bonaparte. And for a few reasons, in that, and you see this today with Trump too, like capitalists have kind of, just this past week, you have Bill Ackman and stuff being like, I don't know if this guy is doing his, good old Zionist Bill Ackman. This guy is doing a good job here. And this is very similar to what happened, where the bourgeois were very much behind Bonaparte. But then when he got into power and started to create discord and started to upset people and actually make it harder for business to happen, the bourgeois were worried that people would start to become revolutionary again. They still were. There were still many of them. But like on a massive level, people would start to resist. And this is one of the capitalism's tactics, is that it tries to maintain just the basic level of satisfaction to prevent people from developing class consciousness so that they can identify what is exactly happening in their lives, how they're being exploited. For another history on this, Foucault really gets into a lot of detail about this in his lectures. Some of his earlier lectures about the different conflicts between the bourgeois and the political elite, and their relationship to taxation, and how the bourgeois kind of sided with workers at times because the workers were misdirecting their anger towards government. And so the bourgeois were actually kind of like pushing workers in a kind of socialist direction at times because they wanted the people, because they were taking advantage of the fact that at that moment the people were still misidentifying the culprit, which is like what's happening today in the US, where people who claim to be angry about capitalism often direct their anger at like Trump, which is great for business and great for the bourgeois because it distracts them from the real exploitative factors here. And so Bonaparte was in a volatile position. He would get flack from his own party, he would get flack from the other party, he would get flack from the bourgeois. Sometimes he would be approved by these people. And when he would get flack, he would then tuck his tail between his legs and hide back behind his party and be like, oh yeah, again, remember, we're the party of order. We're the party of rule of law, that kind of thing. And the people would be like, oh yeah, okay, cool. And then forget about it. It's like, when dealing with these people, it's like a baby with peekaboo, where you cover up your face and then the baby thinks that you're gone, or like you've somehow changed your existence. And it certainly feels that way with like capitalist exploitation and all these other systems and all these other figures, is that they're unable to see it for what it is, and it makes it that much easier for the people who benefit to just be like, oh, peekaboo, and like hide, it's not me, and anything like this. Now, I mentioned earlier that he had appealed to workers somewhat, and he actually established a kind of secret group, a secret society, and it's called the Society of December 10th, or depends on the translation, but the Band of December 10th, that was comprised of, as Marx lays it out, it's like criminals, vagabonds, sex workers, and others, that he wanted to have a kind of wide array of people from a bunch of different settings and backgrounds and subjects and positions, and kind of like early form identity politics, to be like, oh, look, I'm representing all of these people. And he would get them to follow him around to like rallies and stuff and like scream like, vive, Bonaparte, vive l'empereur, like stuff like that, like long live the emperor, which is like, you kind of see it today with like Trump, and whenever there's like a single person of color at one of his rallies, it just seems as though they like find that person and make sure to put him behind Trump, like as he's giving a talk, so that it looks like to diversify the crowd, that kind of a thing. The other term for this, or this kind of group of people, is from Marx. It's the I think that it could be a different. I think it's like the lumpen proletariat, which is also the slum proletariat, which refers to the working class or members of the working class that don't have class consciousness and have totally do not grasp how they're being exploited, and find solace in these figures like Trump, like Bonaparte, who claim to be representing them. Now, again, I just want to emphasize that like the way that I'm presenting this is somewhat chronological, but if you read this text, it's kind of all over the place. So, I mean, I've tried to distill it and present a more chronological version, but like, again, there's so many other figures here, like the people that Bonaparte was running up against. It was like Cavaignac or something like that, who he was running against. I mean, there's that whole saga. Just want to be really clear. Go read the thing yourself if you have the time. But, this should give you a good overview. So by the end of 1851, Parliament was in shambles, and Bonaparte declared himself emperor, all while claiming to represent workers, represent the people. And towards the end of the text, Marx observes that Bonaparte appealed primarily to farmers, and that's because they were largely self-sufficient. And I thought that this was an interesting point that Marx makes toward the end, where he's like, farmers were particularly susceptible to Bonaparte's charm and his kind of magical effects, where it's his hocus pocus effects, as maybe Marx would say, because they were incredibly disjointed and ununified. I don't know, language is hard. They weren't unified, because farmers, it's like you have one big plot of land and they're largely like self-sufficient. They don't have a division of labor they're working with others, so they can't develop class consciousness. They're kind of separated. They have their needs met, and they don't really feel that weight of exploitation quite as neatly as like factory workers, for example. And so farmers, even though they were an exploited class, like no doubt, were more likely to side with these reactionary elements because they didn't yet have a kind of class consciousness. Also, they didn't have means of communication, which is like, it's a very interesting moment here. And I really think that there's a lot to kind of dissect here. That is Marx's prescription that in order to arrive at communism, there needs to be the division of labor. And indeed, this is Marx's one of the things he's really consistent about, something that he picks up from Adam Smith, like the exalting or really celebrating the division of labor. For him, not because it accrues profit, but instead because it can allow for class consciousness. But the other thing is his emphasis upon communication, where Marx believes that if only the people could really communicate with one another and describe their kind of oppression, that therefore they would just develop a kind of class consciousness, which is kind of idealistic. And I'm not against Marx in this way. How would he know? But we would certainly come to see that that is not the case. Increased abilities to communicate would only provide a new vector, a new opportunity for capitalist exploitation. It would be a way by which not to unite people, but to treat people as new forms of like data extraction, a new point of capitalist accumulation. And this is one of Baudrillard's really good points for a critique of the political economy of the sign, where Baudrillard was looking at the ways in which there were these calls among certain socialists to socialize media and communication, like radio and television and stuff. And Marx and Baudrillard was like, are we really going to pretend as though that the structure of these media are not oppressive in themselves in terms of the fact that they and he's talking about radio and television at the time, where he's like, these are media in which there's just implied a speaker and a listener. And Baudrillard's like, is this really what we're going to try to use as the revolutionary medium here? And I think he had a really good point there. And we're seeing it today, the way in which media have been co-opted. Maybe the point is that it just needs to become more socialist. Maybe media just needs to actually be taken over like factories do. Indeed, I mean, things like the internet were created through public funds, so they really should belong to the public. I mean, that is probably the thing. But regardless, I think it was a really dense, interesting moment at the end of the essay when he was considering the factors that limited or prevented class consciousness among workers, among farmers, and the need for communication. But in this case, the farmers that he's referring to, and he's very clear that there were still like revolutionary farmers. It's not as though they were all just reactionary or detached, disinterested, focused on their own self-subsistence. But one of the things that came from this was that these farmers couldn't really represent themselves because they were disconnected from everything, and therefore they were more likely to look to somebody to represent them. And in all of this was revealed that really all Bonaparte really wanted to do, despite claiming to represent the people, the workers, etc., everything like that, he just wanted to steal France and then sell it back to France. All the while, the little bourgeois elements are just like, doing that thing with their hands. What's this called? I don't know. Connivingly doing this. And they're just celebrating the fact that everything is in shambles and turmoil because this is going to be good profit for them. It's going to be good money. And they can just easily step in and exert their own capitalist influence to grab more land, to take more people as wage earners, and to expand their influence and power. But I mean, and the history books will tell you that, Louis had instead, like, he didn't do any of this exploitative stuff. He actually, like, expanded France's mercantile horizons. He modernized France. He brought more, roads and infrastructure to France, etc. Like, the way that history would continue capitalist ideology, leaving these things unexamined. And yeah, Bonaparte would continue to be leader of France until about 1870. He would declare war on Prussia, and he would be captured and die shortly after. I think he was released, but I mean, I'm not a historian. Don't quote me on that. But he would die a couple of decades after this coup, after the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. But yeah, that's pretty much it in a 45-minute nutshell. I hope that it was descriptive. I hope that it gave you a good idea of what this text is about, and really its relevance to understanding what's going on today, understanding how considerations of capital, that was my recycling bin fell down, considerations of capital go unexamined in favor of being concerned with superfluous things or superficial things like political leaders, when really the focus should be on capital itself. But yeah, if there's anything I got wrong, I'd love to hear about it. Anything I omitted, there was a lot I omitted, but if there's anything really material that I should have included, leave a comment. It'll add, people can read it. They'll get more of the insight. That would be really great. But yeah, if you like what I did, you can like, share, subscribe. And on that note, peace.